He said, now this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. He was talking, after all, at the height of the Cold War. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or our democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. General Eisenhower, we should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together. What this administration did, and they were not the first, is they took advantage of our fears, our panic, a real issue, what happened on 9/11, and they ran with it in a process of destroying, knocking out all of the restraints, all of the limitations that make a democratic society possible. And it was lying on a grand scale, and they got away with it. Why? Because of the national security fear. The media collapsed. Journalists, famous journalists, allowed their brains to be embedded, let alone their bodies. The party that was not in power caved totally, went along with these lies. We know now that even the members of the Senate National Security Committee and others, Armed Service Committee, what have you, knew, did not come clean, did not tell us. We've had a succession of books of insiders in the administration. They said never for a moment did they believe it. Chapter 17 of Tenet's book, where he says that he never believed there was a threat that they had with developing WMD, a nuclear bomb. That was just a convenient argument that they could agree on. That they never believed there was a tie between al-Qaeda and Afghanistan and Iraq. The cynicism that just runs right through, not new. It was there in the Gulf of Tonkin when Lyndon Johnson was informed by Captain Herrick of the Maddox that no, I don't think we've been attacked. The evidence is we seem to be the radar picking up our zigzagging in the Gulf of Tonkin. And McNamara and LBJ knew that in real time and yet rushed to the DV cameras to announce they were extending the war to North Vietnam and getting us more deeply involved. The cynicism is not new. It's just that with the terrorist attack of 9/11 and the particular crowd in the White House now, led by, my God, imagine what Eisenhower was thinking when he confronts the image of Dick Cheney. Could there ever be a better example of the military-industrial complex? The revolving door. Here is a company, Brown Root, the subdivision of Halliburton, that was bankrupt. They had been ripped us off in other wars. It was the main one in Vietnam. And now, top of their game. And this company benefits from this, and man has no shame, no idea of a conflict of interest. The very person, if you want to, one example that Eisenhower would have been talking about, it would have been Dick Cheney. And what did they do? They took the fear, frightened the American people, and they developed a notion of war. Terrorism has always been with us. It will always be with us. Always. You know, one man's terrorism is another's national patriot, you know. Terrorists are people who don't have control of state power, so they don't have airplanes of their own. They hijack other people's airplanes. You know, terrorists do terrible damage. They hurt civilians. They're not the only one. You know, those 3.4 million people that got killed in Indochina, they were mostly civilians. When we decided to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those people didn't vote for the emperor. They were mostly civilians. We were trying to make a political point when we targeted them, or when we burned Dresden or the wooden cities of Japan. So terrorism, what we really mean by terrorism is non-state actors, or what the president called rogues, so forth. It's always been with us. And it should be treated as a pathology. It's an example of rage, of impotency, of fear, of madness, whatever you want. Okay? Religious fanaticism, that's not always religious, it could be nationalist fanaticism. So terrorism is a pathology. Instead of treating it as a pathology and analyzing it, being surgical about it, what did this administration do? It turned it into a war. And think about it. If you went to a doctor and you had a bump in your head, and this doctor, without even looking at it, said, let's cut off the leg, you would know there's something bizarre about this. But somehow the media, experts in our government, people on the Council on Foreign Relations, what have you, did not notice this. Here, if there was one place in the Mideast where bin Laden could not operate, it was Iraq. Not the part that we controlled with the fly zone, but the part that Saddam Hussein controlled. He was their sworn enemy. This is clearly outlined in a 9/11 Commission everywhere else you want. He was a secular dictator. They were religious fanatics. They thought he sold out, their worst enemy. But no connection whatsoever. Evidence was fabricated. The Muhammad Atta, the secret meeting in Prague, blah, blah, all turned out to be lies. I interviewed Colin Powell quite recently in a brief little exchange, and I said, you know, how did you go along with this when, in fact, your own State Department intelligence told you in real time that this was all lies, whether it was the aluminum tubes, you know, or the Muhammad Atta meeting. So the State Department got it right. And I said, you know, when Joe Wilson got it right, he said, I didn't know Joe, direct quote, I didn't need Joe Wilson to tell me that we had our own information. Yes, State Department intelligence had it. You know, there was no connection between one event and the other, except fear that you could frighten the American public and go attack a country that has oil and you want to go after. If you believe in military intervention, there was under Clinton and under Bush ample reason to go do a surgical strike if you want to get bin Laden. That's what we're supposed to have special forces for. That's why we have effective, sophisticated airplane. When Clinton sent in those cruise missiles, he was denounced for taking attention away from the important matter of Monica Lewinsky, you may recall. Bush didn't do that. No, let's knock off Iraq. That has nothing to do with it. So I'm going to keep track of the time here, although if this really is an anarchist libertarian crowd, forget the time restraints. And so, you know, and there's a lot to cover here. But the first point then is that when you're dealing with national security, as was evidence in this case, all reason stops. Fear enters, and otherwise intelligent people act like fools, whether they're editorial writers or whether they're senators or whether they're working in the national security. Doesn't matter. They go along with it. And that's what these books tell us. The people stepping out, whether it's O'Neill or any of the others, you know, Clark, what have you. We don't have adults watching the store. There's careerism, as Karen pointed out. There's fear. There's fear of being smeared. And it doesn't work, again, as a journalist, it doesn't work on the local level. On the local level, I say, wait a minute, you gave the zoning permit to these guys and you're getting money and blah, blah, blah. They can't say, you commie, you traitor, you know. Can't pull that argument, you know. Can't even pull it on the national level if you're having a debate about, you know, most of the normal things we talk about. But you get into national security, and that's where it enters. And it doesn't matter, as I say, whether it's one president or another. Let me give you an example. Our problems with this whole misunderstanding of Afghanistan, Iraq, and everything didn't start with a Republican and George W. And I'm perfectly willing to criticize Bush. I mean, I co-authored a book with my son called The 5 Biggest Lies Bush Told Us About Iraq. And the only criticism I've heard of that book is why only 5. And so my defense is they're rubrics. You know, there's hundreds of lies that you could put under. But it didn't begin with George Bush. Just take Jimmy Carter, who I think has been a marvelous ex-president. Really, I mean, brave, he builds houses, he does things, he's actually willing to make some criticism of you know, the Israel lobby, what have you, and talk honestly and so on. Not a very good president. And the worst thing he did as president was he was having trouble with the Iran hostage situation, and he had problems with inflation. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, not Cy Vance, who was a reasonable Secretary of State, Zbigniew Brzezinski had the idea, which he recounted quite gleefully years later in an interview with Nouvelle Observateur, wanted to give the Soviets their Vietnam.